Thanks everybody who has joined in. We will get started shortly. Thanks so much. Good afternoon, everyone who's joining in from the East Coast of the United States. My name is Jeff Abramson. I am the director of the Forum on the Arms Trade, which is a network of experts who work on arms trade, security assistance, and weapons use issues from around the world. There's about 180 experts and emerging experts who are part of the forum. And I'm delighted to host this event with Democracy for the Arab World Now, Dawn. I'm going to start just telling a little bit about the technology. I know a lot of us have been in Zoom webinars before, but this one is set up so that please put your questions into the Q&A. We will be looking at the Q&A. You should also be able to upvote questions in the Q&A if you like. But I've also enabled the chat, so anybody who is an attendee can use the chat as long as the chat remains respectful of each other. This is obviously the topics we'll be talking about are very near and dear and very passionate. Many of us are involved in these issues. And as long as we're treating each other with respect, we can use the chat, although the panelists will be looking at the Q&A. It's a little too hard to also engage in the chat, but do feel free to use the chat as well. I'd like to also let you know that I'm a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. This is a public event, and if any of the media or others would wish to quote what I'm saying, that would be as a fellow at the Center for International Policy. I would like to now sort of frame our event a little bit, and then I'll start turning it over to our excellent panelists. But I just want to start at which I think all of us on the panel share, is that we would condemn attacks on civilians no matter who conducts them. Obviously, in this conversation, we'll be talking mostly about the behavior of Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, but any attack on civilians is condemned, whether that's before October 7th of last year, on October 7th of last year, since October 7th of last year. Just want to be pretty clear about that. Now, this event was planned before the election on Tuesday, and obviously now knowing that there'll be a second Trump administration, that may impact on what these recommendations that the panelists will have, their viability to last beyond the Biden administration. But the situation in the Middle East right now cannot wait. There's still more than 2 months left in the Biden administration. Lives are literally on the line, and what the U.S. does can really make a difference. And we don't have time to wait. So we're hoping that these recommendations, which are made by the panelists, will be things that can make a difference, whether or not the Biden administration does. And we want to make sure that these recommendations are known. And I'm going to frame the conversation a little bit and then turn it over to panelists. I've given them the impossible task of trying to talk about their issues in 5 minutes, and I'll see if I can hold myself to that. But if you doubt what can happen in the last 2 months of an administration, I just look back at the last 2 months of the Trump administration. And exactly 4 years ago today, on November 10th, 2020, Secretary of State Pompeo announced more than $23 billion worth of arms sales to the United Arab Emirates, including F-35s, MQ-9Bs. In December, the Senate narrowly was unsuccessful in blocking those through a resolution of disapproval. In the end of December, on December 23rd, it was announced that the Trump administration notified almost $500 million worth of precision-guided munition sales to Saudi Arabia. And then on December 29th, near the end of the year, certainly within 30 days before the next president was to take office, notified Congress of almost $300 million in small diameter bombs. That was 4 years ago. Also, almost 4 years ago, Biden came into office. And I think many of us who expressed concern about the provision of weapons into these areas were delighted by what he was saying. He was talking about making Saudi Arabia a pariah state. Saudi and UAE behavior in their actions in Yemen had raised a lot of alarm for many of us. And he announced almost immediately a review of arms sales. He paused so-called offensive weapons to Saudi Arabia and sort of seemed to slow walk some of these weapons to the UAE. And he promised a much more human rights-focused conventional arms transfer policy that came out a couple of years later, withdrew from Afghanistan with an idea that we were ending endless wars. There are many signs that there was going to be a change. Now, a lot of us might not remember, but actually in May of 2021, there was actually a bit of for the first time, I'd say, a bit of concern about weapons to Israel. It was announced that some joint direct attack munitions had been notified. Josh can live through this story. It was not very transparent. Things done through the direct commercial sales process are much less transparent. But also the war in Ukraine broke out, and by the middle of July of 2022, this idea of making Saudi Arabia a pariah, this is when the famous fist bump with Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman occurred, probably in relation to keeping oil prices down as part of that conflict. But the United States had been continuing what they would call non-offensive weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. But since then, since that middle of 2022, we've seen a real spike in notified sales to Saudi Arabia, including what I would call offensive weapons. In August of 2022, there was over 3 billion in Patriot missiles. We also saw more recently, October 11th of this year, over $1 billion in Hellfire, Sidewinder missiles, and more recently, TOW, which are sort of anti-tank missiles. The Biden administration has also talked about a defense pact with Saudi Arabia, sort of in the lines of something that might lead to normalization with Israel. That seems to be on the hold right now, but that is still in the ether. The idea of no longer doing deals with autocrats in the region seems to have fallen apart. Thinking about the United Arab Emirates, the United States has continued to sell weaponry to the United Arab Emirates. The biggest one of these was announced in August of 2022 around THAAD missiles, but most recently, just on October 7th, so a month ago, sorry, I lost my notes on October 11th, sorry, 1.2 billion in guided multiple launch rocket systems as well as ATACMS, raising the question of, is this wise to be providing weapons to the UAE? Obviously, there are credible and believable, and I think true reports of the UAE providing weapons into Sudan, where a horrible humanitarian situation is occurring since April of last year with the Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces fighting each other. According to just this October, an IRC report has called this the largest displacement crisis in the world. 8.1 million people of 11 million that have been displaced in Sudan have stayed in Sudan. And according to conservative estimates, more than 20,000 people have been injured, been killed, and 33,000 injured. Obviously, the situation in Israel is what has drawn the most attention, and a number of people are very much engaged in that process. I would say, and Josh will talk more about this, but the United States has provided pretty much an unfettered support for Israel. It's been a very tortured process. Many of us are familiar with the National Security Memorandum 20 that was released in February, sort of requiring Israel to say they are using these weapons properly. 90 days later, so in May, the report came out, and in that report, it was found it is reasonable to assess that Israeli security forces have used U.S. weapons in violation of international humanitarian law or best practices to reduce harm to civilians, but they didn't make a legal determination. The United States has continued to send weapons. The United States is now engaging militarily, including attacking the Houthis in Yemen, helping Israel defend itself against Iran. Obviously, Iran and Israel are now engaged in direct fighting. And on August 13th, the Biden administration notified over $20 billion in arms sales to Israel via the foreign military sales process. We expect some joint resolutions of disapproval that have been led by Senator Bernie Sanders to be brought up this month. And also just at the almost 30 days ago, not quite 30 days ago, Secretaries Austin and Blinken sent a letter to Israel demanding changed behavior. So there's a lot going on. This is difficult, but we have a really great set of panelists here to talk us through this. I've given them the impossible task of 5 minutes each, but let me tell you who they are, and then I'll turn it over to our first speaker. Josh Paul is a senior advisor at Dawn and also president and director of a recently formed organization, A New Policy. As many of you know, and that's how I first met him, for more than a decade, he worked at the Bureau of Political Military Affairs at the State Department, where he engaged on U.S. arms sales. He resigned in October of last year due to his disagreement with the Biden administration on its rush for lethal military assistance to Israel. Dr. Anel Shaleen is also joining in. She's a research fellow at the Middle East program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. She's also a non-resident fellow at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy and a senior non-resident fellow at the Arab Center of Washington, D.C., and a visiting scholar at Georgetown University. Like Josh, she also recently served in government she was a foreign affairs officer at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor's Office of Near Eastern Affairs before she resigned in March of this year in protest over the Biden administration's approach. I knew Anel before, and I'm delighted she's joining in here as well. Omar Ismail is the former acting Minister of Foreign Affairs for Sudan. He'll tell us a lot more about what's happening in Sudan, but he's also currently a senior advisor to the Sudan program at the Yale Humanitarian Research Lab. And last but not least, Negar Mortazavi is an award-winning journalist and commentator, editor, and host of the Iran podcast, and a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy, where I'm also a senior fellow. And she's been busy of late providing insights on how Iran and countries in the region are reacting to the evolving and ongoing conflict. So we're delighted for all of our panelists to join in. I will ask Josh now to turn on his video, and we'll begin with, if you can do it in 5 minutes, Josh, how would you sort of characterize U.S. support for Israel right now? And then I'll ask you a second question after you sort of talk about what you're seeing right now.
Sure, thanks, Jeff, and good to join you. I think the answer to that question is pretty straightforward, right? The Biden administration's policy throughout the last year and before that as well has been one that, to use their own words, of unconditional support. And what that has meant in practice, of course, is open doors, open gates to arms transfers in particular, significant increases in security assistance funding, and very limited, if any, use of the leverage that provides. There have been, I would note, some minor steps that we have seen over the course of the last year, such as the introduction of an executive order that sanctions violent settlers in some cases, such as some changing tone, I think, particularly in how the United States has been talking about this at the United Nations, but no substantive policy changes that one can really point to over the course of the last year, other than a continued desire, in addition to supporting Israel, to do what it can to contain regional escalation. And we know how that has gone so far.
Yeah. So I think everyone on the call knows that you've recommended that the United States end its transfers of weapons to Israel. This is part of the reason why you resigned. Can you tell us what you're recommending now and what you think that would accomplish if the Biden administration were to take it on in the last couple of months?
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. And just to be clear, my recommendation has always been a suspension of lethal military assistance and weapons to Israel that are used in Gaza. I do have 4 recommendations I want to put out here today. I want to make clear that these are recommendations of what I think the Biden administration should do, not what I think they necessarily will do. And over the course of the last year, I've built up a fair amount of expertise in making recommendations about what they should do, not what they will do. I want to make clear that these are, to some extent, blue sky, but they are also all things within the president's remit and things that the president could do if he actually wanted to. So, and actually one more note before I dive into that, right, that we have, I think it's 73 days left in this administration. In addition to what the president does, of course, there are continued windows for Congress. And of course, so we will see, for example, in the next week or two, I believe, votes on joint resolutions of disapproval in the Senate against those arms transfers you mentioned that were notified in August. And I think it has continued to be worth pressing the Senate to take those actions. So 4 quick recommendations. The first one, I think one that is not new to anyone here, apply the damn law. President Biden should direct the Department of State and particularly attorneys, including the legal advisor at the State Department and in the White House, to make the obvious legal determinations that Israel has been restricting US-funded humanitarian assistance to Gaza, and I would argue under Section 502B of the Foreign Assistance Act, that Israel has been engaged in a continuous pattern of gross violations of human rights. Both of these determinations would trigger a restriction, in the first case on security assistance to Israel, in the second case on all forms of security assistance, including arms transfers to Israel. And I would note, of course, that changing a policy is pretty easy to do from one administration to another. changing and walking back a legal determination is somewhat harder. The only other caveat I'd offer here, as we're talking about arms, is my expectation that, in fact, we will see the opposite direction. There are a number of major arms sales, as I understand it, that have been pending in the tiered review process in Congress for the last few months that the Biden administration will be formally notifying for Israel during this lame duck. But that's recommendation number one, enforce the damn law. And recommendation number two, use your leverage. So we know that beyond what the law requires, the president has broad authority to withhold arms. And I believe that President Biden should use that authority, particularly to restrict the lethal transfer of lethal weapons of the types that are being used in Gaza. In addition to pausing those transfers for the remainder of his term, he could stop replenishing as well the war reserve stockpile in Israel, the Warsaw stockpile, from which Israel is withdrawing arms. He could pause the processing of pending arms sale cases, including both export licenses and foreign military sale cases. And if nothing else, this would first of all force a corresponding pause at some point in Israel's operations in the region, because they do require that sort of just-in-time delivery, particularly when it comes to some types of aircraft spare parts. And I think that that would be, something that then the Trump administration would have to take a conscious decision to turn back on. And in some of these cases, there would be, I do believe, if not an immediate impact, a near-term impact. Third thing,
the third and fourth very quickly, Josh.
yes, third thing, expand sanctions. So we know that there are these settlement sanctions under the executive order. A new president can get rid of an executive order. So I think going forward, the Biden administration should continue with those sanctions, particularly on the settlement councils and ministers Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, but should do so as well under the Magnitsky law, which requires reporting to Congress if those sanctions are rolled back. And fourth recommendation, and this is, I realize, sort of the longest shot of all, but also I would argue the most important if it were to happen and the most difficult to roll back, and that is recognizing Palestinian statehood. If the US, which President Biden can do, recognizes Palestinian statehood and through its seat on the UN Permanent Security Council, gets the UN Security Council to accept Palestine as a full member of the UN, the latter is something that cannot be rolled back by a single country. And I think would significantly alter the legal stakes, at least, in the Middle East, and as well as many of the political stakes. So Palestinian statehood by the US and by the UN.
Great, thanks so much, Josh. Lots to talk about there too, and some good thinking about what could be done and actually carry on. I'd like to ask Anel to turn on her video. I first met Anel when we were working on the Yemen conflict many years ago, and when she was looking at the Saudis and the Emiratis. I'd like to sort of ask you if you could characterize Saudi Arabia right now. What do you see as the sort of the U.S. approach towards Saudi Arabia? And then obviously I'll ask my second question, which I think you can guess.
Well, first, it's a real pleasure to get to be here. And first, I also just wanted to say that I support everything that Josh recommends, in particular, the absolute need for the United States to recognize the sovereignty of the Palestinian people, to recognize a Palestinian state. As Josh said, these are not things we think will necessarily happen, but a lot of what I'm going to talk about has to do with the image of the United States abroad and the damage that the Biden administration has done to it. And I think establishing U.S. support for a state of Palestine is one of the only things that could be done to try to address some of that. So first, just kind of an overview of the U.S. approach to Saudi Arabia. Jeff, really appreciated some of your reminders of where Biden was when he came in on this issue. And there really was this sense that, first of all, that Trump had been just doing absolutely everything possible to bolster the U.S.-Saudi relationship, and your reminder of the ways that administrations at the very end of their term do try to rush things through. And so, although we don't expect that a lot of these recommendations will necessarily be acted upon, as Josh said, a lot of these are within the president's remit. He could do these. And so I think for those of us here and those on the call, to try to push Biden to move past a legacy of genocide would go a long way. But so just the way, as Jeff pointed out, like U.S. policy towards Saudi Arabia started off in one area with Biden saying he was going to hold Saudi Arabia accountable. Even looking back to things like people may remember the 2018 midterms when the brutal murder of Jamal Khashoggi provided a shockingly vivid example of what Trump's blank check to the Saudis had engendered. And Biden campaigned on that. The Russian invasion of Ukraine shifted many policy priorities for the Biden administration. When the US was trying to impose this worldwide boycott on Russian oil, suddenly Saudi fossil fuels became much more important, especially for European partners and allies who had previously relied on Russian oil and natural gas. So Biden's campaign trail promise to hold MBS accountable was a principled stand that he could no longer afford to take. So we saw Biden travel to Saudi Arabia to bend the knee in 2022. And then, as Jeff mentioned, it was 2 weeks later that he notified Congress of a potential $3 billion arms sale to Saudi Arabia. And then over the following year, we saw this shift towards pushing for a US security guarantee as part of this broader Saudi-Israel normalization deal. And we know that the Biden team was really attached to this idea that they were going to one-up the Trump administration's Abraham Accords and sort of deliver the land of the two holy mosques, Saudi Arabia arguably the leader, at least in terms of religious authority, and certainly a very powerful country in the Middle East. To have Saudi Arabia normalize with Israel, this would be seen as a huge diplomatic achievement, at least in the eyes of people like Brett McGurk. And so we saw a complete flip-flop on Biden's stance towards Saudi Arabia as needing to hold them accountable, in particular for things like the Saudis' brutal war against Yemen. And instead now talk of this US security guarantee, in which would have included, or might still include, a US support for a civilian nuclear program, which we know if that were to occur, other US partners in the region would also clamor for their own nuclear programs. So Iran would certainly sprint towards a bomb, and there would be questions about the possibility of nuclear weapons proliferation and a nuclear arms race in the Middle East. So
let me ask you what you would recommend he do now in the last couple of months. Thanks, Anil.
Certainly. So what he should do instead, I mean, I think just the most basic recommendation is don't spend your final 73 days in office trying to force through a US Saudi Israel deal, or the Biden administration had even talked about that Israel wouldn't even have to be part of it, that the US and Saudi Arabia might conclude their own defense agreement, and it wouldn't even require normalization with Israel. This was premised on concerns the White House has about competition with China, and wanting to sort of procure Saudi Arabia on the US side. I think this is nonsensical because, first of all, the US or the Saudi-China relationship is not really predicated on a defense agreement or defense partnership in the first place. It is an economic relationship, and a defense agreement would really do very little to undermine that partnership, which is quite strong. So that's the first recommendation is don't try to shove that through. In terms of more pie in the sky recommendations, I think it would be ideal if, before we head into Trump 2.0, for Biden to go back to these campaign promises, for him to go back to the need to prioritize human rights in American foreign policy. In my experience working in human rights at the State Department, it was not a priority, but it should be. And it is certainly a way that Biden had initially sought to distinguish himself and his administration from the ways in which Trump did not view human rights as important. So part of this would not just be about Saudi Arabia, but would include policies toward Israel, and just affirm the fact that under US law, the United States is not allowed to send security assistance to countries that are engaged in gross violations of human rights. That this is a part of the law that has never actually been applied, but it has been on the books since the mid-1970s, and would require a fundamental shift in US foreign policy. Do I think it's likely? No. But I do think that now that he really has nothing to lose, Biden should affirm the need for the United States to distinguish itself on the world stage by prioritizing human rights. I think another really important thing to signal here is the need for Biden, as still the leader of the Democratic Party, to signal to congressional Democrats what he hopes that they would not do under a Trump term. And that would be, for example, to sign on to a defense agreement with Saudi Arabia. So to make clear now that, sure, that may have been a priority earlier on, but we don't want to hand this to Trump. And in general, this would not be in U.S. interest. So hopefully congressional Democrats would not be willing to go along with that under a Trump term. And finally, although I don't expect this to happen, I think it would be great if Biden could go back to his campaign promise to support international institutions. So the UN Security Council, the UN Human Rights Council, as well as the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice, both of which his administration and Congress have denigrated in their efforts to hold Israel accountable for its genocidal actions in Gaza. And I'll stop there.
I just got to find my unmute button. Thanks so much, Anil, and thanks for digging in a bit more deeply than I did in my overview and for those recommendations. I'll now ask Omer Ismail to turn on his video, if he would. And Omer, I think for many of us, we're less familiar with the crisis in Sudan, the UAE's contribution to this. So if you could sort of give us a little bit of information about that, and then obviously, if you think the U.S. behavior, especially in relation to the UAE, should change, what those recommendations would be. Let me turn it over to you, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Jeff, and it's great to be here with these knowledgeable colleagues. The historical ties that the UAE has with Sudan was not only with the RSF. It has also its ties with the armed forces during the time that I was in government. And the RSF, the Rapid Support Forces, was one of the supporters of the armed forces in Sudan. This approach of the UAE in Sudan has something to do with the Saudi-led coalition that both the RSF and the SAF, the Sudan Armed Forces, contribute arms and personnel to that effort. The UAE then tend to support the RSF to bolster its capabilities against the Sudan Armed Forces. And that is because the UAE has strategic interest in Sudan, begins with the Red Sea, and also it has economic strategy that is built on the trade on gold. Sudan, as we know, became the second exporter of gold in Africa after South Africa, and a little bit as the edge on Ghana. Not because of all the gold that is coming out of Sudan, but also the gold from the Sahel. And as far as the DRC, some gold found its way through Sudan and to the markets in the UAE. Mostly the Sudan Armed Forces and the RSF were engaged in the smuggling of that gold to the demise of the Sudanese people. So the strategy of the UAE in Sudan hinged upon its economic ties and its strategic ties as well. And also the UAE is trying to play a diplomatic role, although that is very difficult now in light of the total alignment with the RSF. And that diplomatic effort, together with the United States and regional countries like the Saudi Arabia and Egypt and others, this is kind of like a very delicate balancing act for the UAE to play. Also, the UAE with Sudan has other ties that might be geopolitical as well, because they're trying to find an edge to counterbalance the interests of Turkey, Qatar, and probably also Saudi Arabia in Sudan. So because of that, the United Arab Emirates supported the UAE, they supported the RSF, not only with arms, but also with finance, according to the reports that are out there. So this alleged support made the RSF capable of standing up in this war together with the RSF, together with the SAF, and against the Sudanese people, actually, because the figures that you, Jeff, gave are astonishing figures of 8-point-something people that left the country, and about 1 million people now displaced inside the country, and also a looming famine. The impact of this war and the toll on the Sudanese people is unimaginable. So with that, I will go straight to the recommendations. And I think the diplomatic effort of the United States should be focused on talking directly to the UAE about its support to the RSF, and also enhance its efforts, the diplomatic efforts, since it has both ties to the SAF and the RSF, at least in the past. Then we can use that in the future to try to broker some sort of peace, or at least a ceasefire that will lead to a lasting peace in Sudan. That is one. And also, the US could try the Magnitsky Global Act to levy some sanctions on some of these actors that are supporting the RSF through the UAE, if not through the government of the UAE, but they are actors and intermediaries that use the UAE to support the RSF with these arms. So sanctions on these intermediaries, entities, and individuals, I think, is going to be welcome by the Sudanese people. And also the effort of a multilateral effort with the African Union and the countries in the region, the neighboring countries that are going to be affected, if not already affected, by the conflict in Sudan, is important. And if it is led by the United States, because it has leverage in the region, that is going to be very effective. And also, I believe, finally, that the security situation in Sudan should lead the United States also to think of what will happen if Sudan is left to its own devices, and the whole region, which is already in turmoil, turned into becoming part of or supporting one or the other of the parties. And I'm talking about Libya, I'm talking about Chad, I'm talking about the Central African Republic, all countries that are suffering from their own internal conflicts, except Egypt maybe, but it also has its own economic challenges that are also tied to Sudan. This is going to be important for the remaining time of the Biden administration to try to have an impact in stopping this war and bringing peace and some sort of normalcy to the lives of the Sudanese people. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Omar. And I have a feeling others you might want to weigh in on what some others have said as well, but that's great. I'm cognizant of time. We're running a little bit slow, but I want to turn it over now to Nagar. Obviously, Iran is, we haven't talked about Iran so far, but if you could turn on your video. I'm wondering, now we see we see Israel and Iran directly in military conflict. But I wonder what you think, how the United States has portrayed Iran in this situation. What do you think the U.S. approach has been? And then I'll ask you a separate question after that. But could you characterize sort of what you think the U.S. is perceiving and maybe what it's getting wrong?
Sure. Thank you so much. Thanks, Jeff, for hosting this. And it's an honor, a pleasure to be on with this excellent group of panelists, especially the brave ones who resigned from their jobs and careers over their disagreement with the policy. I come at this from a slightly different perspective. Iran is obviously my focus, US-Iran relations, but I would say all of this sort of ties in together at the end. Different perspective, because obviously Iran, unlike Saudi Arabia, Israel, is not a U.S. ally. In fact, it's a U.S. rival or foe. But it's also very much involved by indirectly in the conflict that's been expanding in the region. And I would say it's probably the most important actor, one of the most, if not the most important actor in sort of changing the course, shifting the trajectory of this conflict. And I think the U.S. has a lot of leverage and possibilities that they can do here. So just to sort of take a step back and take a very quick look at U.S. policy towards Iran, which obviously is a component of that bigger policy towards the Middle East under the Biden administration. So President Biden, or candidate Biden, actually, before he became president, criticized former President Donald Trump for his sort of foreign policy towards Iran, of the so-called maximum pressure. Donald Trump pulled out of the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, despite Iran abiding by its end of the agreement. He imposed draconian sanctions, economic sanctions on Iran, which have had a devastating impact on the Iranian economy, although they didn't bring much policy change on the country. The sanctions didn't achieve sort of the policy change that they were intended, but nevertheless, they have hit the Iranian economy very hard. Sanctions have been imposed on almost every major industry, including, of course, the oil industry, which is the largest in Iran. And so, and also, let's not forget, President Trump assassinated the top Iranian general, Qasem Soleimani, in 2020, and essentially brought the two countries, the US and Iran, to the brink of war. And that war was averted back then. But I think what sort of the critique of the Biden administration's policy towards Iran and the region was that when they were not in the White House, when they were sort of opposition to the Trump administration, they were very critical of Trump's policies, of the policy of maximum pressure, of pulling out of the JCPOA, which was a legacy of the Obama-Biden administration. President Biden used to be vice president. And then also the sort of reckless, as the Democrats call it, the reckless or the dangerous assassination of that top Iranian general, which brought the two countries on the brink of war. And candidate Biden, one of the promises on the campaign trail was that he's going to make a return to the nuclear deal with Iran. He's going to prioritize diplomacy in general, human rights, and all of that. And also the issue of making Saudi Arabia a rook, as Anal mentioned, and other policies. When candidate Biden became President Biden, when his team, the administration, entered the White House, we didn't see much of that promise or the sort of talking point or the criticism of the Trump policies, and also the vision that many had for that administration sort of become true. So the Biden administration had a short window of opportunity with the moderate administration in Iran of Hassan Rouhani to return to the JCPOA, the nuclear deal. They missed that window, and they sort of slowly but gradually sort of adopted, or at least continued, the maximum pressure campaign. They wouldn't call it the maximum pressure campaign. To this day, if you ask them if they have implemented maximum pressure, they probably wouldn't agree. And the rhetoric towards Iran changed slightly, although that has also shifted in the past year. But besides that, as far as actual policy change, we didn't see much of that attempt to prioritize diplomacy. And then obviously the presidential election happened in Iran, all of that. So fast forward to today, I would say the time is very short, but it's still not running out. So the Biden administration still has some time before the end of this presidency. And I think the key sort of to de-escalation in the region, or one of the keys, one of the pillars, is to be able to de-escalate with Iran, both between Iran and Israel, but also the United States, which has this leverage of sort of the sanctions or sanctions relief in exchange for de-escalation. It's something the Iranians have been asking for, pushing for, the ceasefire in Gaza, sort of the end of war, de-escalation now in the new front in Lebanon, towards the attacks towards their closest ally, which is Hezbollah. And I think sort of back in April, when we saw that episode, the tit for tat between Iran and Israel, I think the administration drew a clear red line for the Israelis that they wouldn't participate in the offense against Iran and only help them in the defense. That has changed. That dynamic has changed. I think that red line has become blurred now with the transfer of the defense systems and sort of more green light from the US to Israel to go into Lebanon and expand that front. And we see that the Israelis are also pushing more towards a direct confrontation with Iran. So it's a dangerous time. The war has only expanded in the past year. I've really seen no major de-escalation in any front. In fact, it's only been escalation. It's only been expanded. And people ask if this is turning into a big Middle East regional war. I would say it has already turned into a big regional war in the Middle East. And so time is short, but I think there is still time, and the US has a lot of leverage and possibility to sort of reverse course and move toward de-escalation and a ceasefire, taking into account all of these important actors.
Thanks, Nagar. For a quick follow-up, I think you followed this more closely. I hope I'm not a question out of left field, but I saw in the news a couple of weeks ago about a little bit about Iran and Saudi Arabia conducting joint exercises. I'm wondering, in your take on sort of reading the region, if the United States were to take a more diplomatic approach, do you think there are mechanisms within the region that would also sort of ratchet down the I guess the competition of Iran with its neighbors? I mean, obviously Israel and Iran are hard to separate, but I'm thinking about the other countries there.
Yes, it's a great question, Jeff. There are actually so many moving parts. We don't have enough time to discuss all of them. But Iran and Saudi didn't have diplomatic relations for a number of years. And that rapprochement, or the sort of deal, the agreement that came between the two a few years ago, was actually an opening and a shift in the region. As a result, also, I would say, of Iran losing hope in sort of their approach or their engagement with the West, with the US, after the US pulled out of the nuclear deal, and also the Iranians sort of lost hope that the Biden administration would be able to revive it. So that agreement with Saudi Arabia, I know many in Washington are not fond of that agreement. They criticize it mainly maybe because China was the one who cut the ribbon at the end and sort of took the credit for it. But I think that was a major shifting, and also provide a different perspective, both for Tehran and also for Saudi Arabia. I think that the thinking in Tehran, and now we're hearing that more in also public discourse, is that we can't fight all of our neighbors. So while the focus is maybe on Israel and the US as its big supporter, trying to amend and modify the relationship with some of the Arab rivals, including Saudi Arabia, which is the biggest one, I think is the path that Iran has taken and seems to be sustaining it then. So the news, the reporting of a potential interest of the joint military operations, I think, is an indication of that. And also, obviously, just to wrap it up, the Abraham Accords, that sort of that policy which Trump started, the Biden team criticized, but then came in to champion it. The big prize for that, obviously, is Saudi Arabia. And I think the Iranians also see that, and they understand the framing of how the Abraham Accords was also framed as, or packaged as, an anti-Iran alliance. And so they're trying to also get into that dynamic to improve their ties with Saudi Arabia to the extent that it's possible.
Great. Thanks so much, Nagar. It's fascinating. I mean, there's so many things to discuss and pick apart. If all the panelists could now turn on their videos, I'd like to turn a little bit to the Q&A. There was a question here from Abigail that Anel answered with in writing, but I wonder if any of the other panelists would like to take this on. And also, if you have a comment on what a different panelist has said, feel free to throw that into the conversation as well. I'm hoping we can make this interactive amongst the panelists as well. But there's some basic questions about, is Biden unlikely to transfer to cut off arms to Israel? He's got nothing to lose. Is this 30-day period that's about to expire a lever that could be used? So maybe I'll give Josh the first response on that, but if anybody wants to jump in on that, and then I'll go to some other questions also. But if someone has a comment on what another panelist has said, feel free to add that too.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. So I see one of the questions from Abigail in the chat there starts by asking if it is too late to cut off arms. It is certainly late. And I and others have been arguing for over a year now that the time to use the leverage that we have through our arms transfers is now. That said, it's never too late. And I think that there is still an impact that can be had leverage to be had even in the course of the last 3 months, because we've seen a significant increase in Israeli operations in the north of Gaza and indications of intent to essentially ethnically cleanse that part of the strip. So I think it is important to address those. And let's also remember that where the United States leads, others follow. And by taking steps like this now, President Biden can make it easier for countries in Europe, such as the UK, the Netherlands, France, and particularly Germany, to start to follow in those footsteps, ahead of what I suspect in any event will be a divergence of paths between Europe and the US under the incoming administration.
Thanks, Josh. And I saw you worked in another one of the questions, which was what might this lead to for behavior for Europeans? I see, Nagar, you've got your hand up. Let's go over to you next.
Can I just add very quickly, this is obviously Josh's expertise, but I want to also come at this beyond just an arms sales point. I think the US has absolute leverage over Israel, and it's not just on arms. So the United States is providing arms, financial support, diplomatic coverage, every UN Security Council veto, sort of every comment in the global stage. All of these have been sort of putting the US thumb on the scale for over a year. And we constantly hear this excuse that even if we do stop this or remove the support, nothing will change. Well, why not try it and see if it actually will? I believe it will. And the US has a lot of leverage, and it basically hasn't used any of it beyond a few leaks and reporting that the president has yelled at the Israeli prime minister in some private calls.
Thanks, Nagar. Before I go to you back, Josh, Anel, you've been answering some questions in the Q&A. Do you want to go to yourself, or should I go to Josh next?
I think Josh's expertise is probably more directly relevant here.
Okay, well, Josh, you had your hand up, and Anel, why don't you've been answering some questions in the Q&A, but maybe you want to speak some of those answers or take up some other points.
Yeah, I was just going to say briefly that I think the US does have an immense amount of leverage over Israel. I think the incoming Trump administration is certainly aware of how to use that type of leverage as well, not only in the Israel context, but in other contexts as well, should it want to. I was just going to say that, I think we do also have to recognize that the leverage available to the Biden administration at this point is much more limited than it was even 3 days ago. And that's why the recommendations that I've put forward today are really those that, yes, leverage is one of them, and it's arms transfer suspension, but things that can be a bit more enduring, such as legal determinations, such as recognition of Palestinian statehood.
Thanks. Anel, did you want to jump in on some of the things you've been answering, or a different question?
Sure. I mean, one question that came up in the chat was the way that the Biden administration has been portraying, the genocide in sort of like small chunks, or it's like we are very disappointed, or it just, I mean, to answer the question, to try to combat this, I mean, there are very clear laws here, and I really appreciate in particular the way that the UN Special Rapporteur for Human Rights in Palestine, Francesca Albanese, has been emphasizing that the US has an obligation to rein in the actions of any other country, including Israel, even if the concern was that there's inadequate leverage to change their behavior. The US still has an obligation to try legally under international law. And so I'm so tired of this notion that the US doesn't have leverage and we're running out of time to use our leverage. Look, the important thing here would be for the Biden administration to actually try to do something. Although I wish it could have happened a long time ago, I think now it's better late than never. And again, it would also signal, I think there was, again, this question of, is it too late? I mean, Israel is expending massive amounts of ammunition and does not have stockpiles anymore, to my understanding. Josh can correct me on that. But that if the US were to suddenly cut off weapons right now, this would signal that, yes, in fact, Israel is quite dependent on the United States. They would be waiting for Trump to come in to send them more, but it would push back against this notion that, oh no, the US can't actually do anything, which I think could help spur congressional Democrats, whom I expect to suddenly find their consciences and recognize that genocide is wrong now that they're not trying to cover up for their own president. that I hope that Democrats in Congress will do what they can to try to block the coming weapon sales that we know the Trump administration is going to try to push through to Israel, to Saudi, to the UAE, to Egypt in general.
Thanks, Anil. Nagar, I see you have your hand up again.
Yes, I see an Iran question about Brian Hook reporting came that he may be tasked with the transition to the State Department. Brian Hook was the Iran envoy, the US envoy for Iran under President Trump, and essentially one of the key personnel in that sort of policy of maximum pressure. And so I think for Trump 2.0, those of us who are watching the region, Middle East policy, US policy towards the region, at least myself, I'm having an open mind just because the past 4 years of Biden administration didn't really change. And so if the sort of the Democrats essentially left that lane open and the Trump team, Trump and Vance, came in with all these talking points on peace and on ending the war and making a deal with Iran, let's see if we can do it. Although I would say a lot of probably this administration, like the first Trump term, is coming from personnel. And so if the personnel are going to be the same team as John Bolton, Pompeo, Brian Hook, the maximum pressure team, I don't know how you can reverse that policy. But nevertheless, I'm having an open mind to see if the second Trump term can actually bring about some form of de-escalation and essentially less war or peace to the region.
Thanks so much. I'm scanning the questions, but maybe Omer, that wasn't asked, but maybe I could just turn to you and see if you have any comments on what you're hearing from others, as well as, you know, I would say, and maybe I'm wrong, maybe the people disagree, but I think the situation in Sudan, the connection to the Middle East, the connection to the sort of US support into the Middle East is not well understood here in the United States. And I'm wondering, do you think you give some recommendations on how to prioritize or do some actions, but are you feeling that the Trump administration might also be willing to take some of these steps, or any comments on what other people have said, or raising the profile of the humanitarian situation in Sudan?
I wish that the Trump administration will pay more attention to the issue in Sudan. Traditionally, the issues in Africa, the conflicts in the continent had not been in the priorities of the policymakers in the United States. But I think it is important looking at it from a security lens to do that, and also looking at it from a humanitarian lens is important, because the humanitarian situation in Sudan is now characterized or described by the UN and other agencies as the largest humanitarian problem in the world today. Not to pay attention to that is really hurting not only the Sudanese people, but many around the region. So it is important for the policymakers and important for the Trump administration that is coming in to prioritize that as something that is important. And it is related also to what is happening in the Middle East because of the involvement of Saudi Arabia, UAE, and Egypt, and many other countries also. The issue of the Great Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia and what is happening in Ethiopia today, and the rivalry between Egypt and Ethiopia over the Nile waters, and Sudan is in the middle. That is also something that is important in the overall geopolitics of the situation. And also, we mentioned before that the neighborhood itself, having countries like South Sudan and Eritrea and Libya and all the issues that are related to these countries, they are all neighbors of Sudan. And so by looking at that, you find out that a big chunk of the population of Africa are in turmoil should the situation remain as it is and escalate further into the making the conflict even worse.
Great, thanks so much. As I'm looking through the questions, I think actually we have touched on pretty much all of them in the Q&A, which I really appreciate the panelists for doing. I realize we're now sort of in the last few minutes. I want to say that I know a number of these panelists will be involved in events over the next couple of weeks that are looking specifically at what the new Trump administration might mean. We will send, this recording will be available. We'll also try to send some resources around. But I just want to open it now to all of you for 1 minute if you have any closing remarks, and then I will thank you all and the attendees for joining in.
Well, since I'm not hearing anyone else, let me just finally jump in there. As you said, Jeff, there'll be other opportunities to talk about what comes after January 20th. I think that we're in a period now where I think, particularly given the election results, there will be a lot of senior administration officials, both in the White House and in the executive agencies, who need to start really thinking hard about their legacy. And while it is too late for, tens of thousands in Gaza, I think that there are still some opportunities there to salvage something, and also to send a signal to their own party that it is not too late for that party to change either when it comes to the establishment. And so I think both as a domestic policy matter, as an international relations matter, as a humanitarian matter, I would like to see the administration on its way out take up some of the proposals that we've adopted here and do what they can. It is never too late to do the right thing.
Thank you, Josh. Might be hard for anybody to follow after you, but does anybody else want to have some closing thoughts?
There was something that had come up that Josh responded to in the Q&A about AIPAC, but I do think it's really important, although obviously it seems like AIPAC is as powerful as ever, given their successful efforts to oust Cori Bush and Jamal Bowman from Congress. They are having to spend more money and getting, their influence, sort of this perception of foreign influence and the influence of the Israel lobby is talked about much more openly than it was 13 months ago. And so I do think there's a real opportunity here. I think that generational change is coming on this. And certainly encourage people to check out Josh's new organization that he sent a link to in the chat, which is trying to sort of work on pushing for that kind of change on U.S. policy towards Israel. But also in general, just one takeaway for thinking about the election, just the way that Trump was able to successfully portray himself as the peace candidate or the less warlike candidate. I really hope that the Democrats learn from that. I think this was something that was a dynamic that we saw play out with Hillary Clinton in 2016 that Trump was able to do fairly successfully then. And I just hope that moving forward, we as the foreign policy establishment can understand that Americans really are tired of unnecessary wars abroad.
Thanks so much, Anil. Nagar, Omer, any final thoughts?
I would say that I echo what my colleague said in terms of the legacy of this administration. There is time to salvage some of the issues that are happening in the world today, and Sudan and its war is among them, and its relationship with the Middle East. And also, I hope that part of that will also be extended in the new administration, that the policymakers will look at this as not only something that the Biden administration has done, but also is something that the U.S. is doing to maintain peace and security, and also paying attention to the humanitarian issues of the world.
Thanks so much. Nagar, I saw you on mute. I don't know if you wanted to jump in.
Just quickly, I agree with everything that was said. Again, I don't think it's too late yet. It's the war has been expanding and just escalating and getting worse by the day or week or month. And every single civilian, every child, every woman, elderly person, one less per day would be an achievement. Again, I think the U.S. has a lot of leverage across the region, not just on its ally Israel, but also to sort of be able to readjust and shift its posturing and policy towards the region. Unfortunately, the Biden administration missed a lot of opportunities the past 4 years. Time is very short, but I think there is still some time to make some shift within the next couple of months to at least make some changes to the legacy.
Great, thanks. Really great conversation. Obviously, tough issues we're dealing with. I appreciate the optimism and the reminder that the moment still matters and doing the right thing is always the right thing. I will just want to thank Josh, Anel, Nagar, and Omer for providing their expertise. As you all attendees leave, you'll be taken to a poll to sort of tell us how this went, give us advice, which we very much welcome. But let me thank also Dawn for co-sponsoring this event, thank all the panelists, and thank everyone for their questions and for joining in. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.